again, and welcome back to the PhatPhish Guitar Studio. I'm Dave, and this video talking about kind of constructing solos and playing lead lines over chord progressions. Now this applies whether you're one of those people who sits and actually composes solos before you go into a piece, or whether you're somebody who just kind of improvises and basically makes stuff up as you go along. There's still, even if you're improvising, there's still kind of processes you can go through to kind of compose with a lowercase c your solos to kind of make them a bit more effective. Because if you know what key you're playing in, you understand the chords, and this is where music theory understanding is useful. If you know what chords you've got, what key you're playing in, you understand the scale choices. Now you could just play through taking notes almost like at random from a scale, and you're not going to go wrong, but the solo that you play might not be particularly inspirational or particularly exciting. There's a few things you can do, and as always these are guidelines. There's going to be exceptions to the rule, but this is just some things to think about which will help you kind of construct more meaningful and, if you like, better lead lines. First thing to think about is the idea that a solo is basically, it's a series of phrases, in the same way that a conversation or a story is basically, it's a series of sentences composed of words. A solo is a series of musical phrases composed of notes. And the way that you string the words in a sentence or the notes in a phrase together gives the sentence or the solo its meaning and its purpose. And the first thing I want to kind of talk about is the idea of a target note. And this is probably one of the most important things about how you construct a solo. And that's thinking about what note do you want to arrive on at the end of a phrase. Now all the notes in a phrase are important, and the timing of them and all that. But what's really important is where you end, because if you think about a phrase, it goes somewhere, and where you rest, where you kind of pause at the end of a phrase, it'll have a certain amount of tension or a certain amount of release, particularly how that note relates to the underlying chord. Now, so if I play like an A minor chord, and play an E over the top of it, and it sounds reasonably resolved and happy. If I play an A chord, and F over the top of it, it's got a little bit more tension, because in one case I'm playing a fifth degree, which is a strong note, it's a chord tone. The other case I'm playing a flat six, which isn't such a strong note, and it gives you more tension. And that's what a solo really is. It's about building up tension and building up release. Now, like I was saying before, if you just play notes from the scale, you just basically you're playing it safe. It's just it's all going to be incredibly neutral. Whereas if you play phrases, sometimes you rest on or you come to target a strong note that sounds really resolved, and it sounds kind of happy where that phrase goes. Or other times you finish on a note which is a bit more tense, a bit like less resolved, more dissonant. Then the listener's going to want you to take that piece on. So it's all about a trade-off for the listener of hearing a bit of tension and a little bit of release, and you getting the balance right. So the idea of just having target notes, the notes at the end of each phrase, how it sits against the underlying chord, how it kind of sits against like the target note or the last note in the previous phrase that you played, because it's quite useful to take phrases and to repeat them, and they become like a theme to your solo. But each time you play a theme, you might play with a slightly different variation, or you work through and you finish on a different target note. So you could think about this, a good example, if you think of if you were writing a story, you want it's like a story, what we call a story arc, so where the story goes from, where it goes to. So if you think about, chapter 1, you introduce a character, and that's the end of the chapter. It's fairly settled. Chapter 2, you introduce another character. Now, at the end of that, you might, if you're writing that story, you might want to finish that chapter with a little bit more sort of like anticipation. Well, now you've got two characters. Chapter 3, the characters meet up. You can finish that chapter with a bit more tension, like, well, what are these characters going to do? Chapter 4, the characters do something. then something happens and you finish that chapter on a real cliffhanger, and then you get to the last chapter where everything kind of comes to resolution and you know they all live happily ever after, that type of thing. So you've got your story arc. Now, regardless of like who those characters are, how they meet, what they do, how that comes to resolution, it doesn't matter what that is, you've still got the story arc of settled introduction, a little bit of anticipation, a lot more anticipation, real cliffhanger, conclusion. Yeah. So that's what I mean by having like a series of target notes. So you kind of build up a bit of tension, a bit of release. So you've got like a storyline, like a theme, like an arc through your solo that you're playing over the chord progression. Now the notes that you play in the individual phrases, they matter because they kind of govern how the individual phrases sound. But you could play any, if you like, you could play any phrase, but as long as it ends on that particular target note, it gives you the idea of tension and release. So if, you know, I could have a phrase, something like, well, I'm playing something, key of A minor, basically minor pentatonic type notes, but I'm finishing on the one note. Or I could play something like, I'm taking more notes from the natural minor mode. It gives it a slightly different feel, but it's still a means of going from this note to this note, and I'm finishing on the one, on the tonic, which has got a certain amount of resolution. Actually, it's got quite a lot of resolution because it's the one note. But so you could take phrases, you could repeat them with a little variation. So I could play a series of phrases like, so then I'm basically playing the same phrase, but one time I'm finishing it on, which is the flat third, so it's got a certain amount of tension to it. It's not super resolved. And then the second time I'm finishing it on an A, on the one, which is a little bit more resolved. So there, the listener kind of gets a journey. You hear a phrase introduced, a little bit of tension because you're not finishing on a super strong note. Then same phrase again, it's familiar, and then you take the listener somewhere else and you give them a bit of resolution because you're finishing on the one note. So there's a really simple example, and that's something you could kind of expand on, you know, right the way through a solo. And something else to think about is just kind of what the intervals are between the notes that you're playing. If you're using fairly small intervals, like use lots of adjacent notes to give you a very smooth motion through the melody line, or if you're going for bigger intervals, so something that's a little bit more challenging, kind of jumps around a little bit. And you can vary that by throwing in the odd unexpected note. Now, one of my favourite things to do in this regard is just be playing like a normal, like normally picked sort of lead line, but then throw in a harmonic. Yeah, so that harmonic there just kind of jumps out, and if you include that in something like that in a lead line, it keeps the interest going. It stops it from just being a series of reasonably, you know, safe one note follows another type of thing. Like I say, a good lead line is all about tension and release, making the listener feel kind of relaxed and at home, and then throwing in something that's a little bit unexpected just to grab their attention. You know, it's the same way that if you were, again, to take the story analogy, if you were reading a story that's just, you know, completely monotonous, nothing exciting happens, you're going to get bored. You're going to want to shut that book. It's not because of something that the author's done, it's because of what the author hasn't done. They haven't introduced something exciting. Whereas if they take you on that story arc, and you think, oh, okay, I've got to the end of this chapter, it's a real cliffhanger, I want to go on to the next chapter, what's going to happen? But then within that story, something really unexpected happens, or, you know, the thing that you want to happen at the end, you want them, kind of the characters to ride off into the sunset or live happily ever after. If you get that resolution at the end, as a reader, you're happy. And it's the same thing with a guitar solo or a lead line. If you finish on this, like, the safe note, something super resolved, the listener's going to think, oh, right, okay, that I enjoyed that. You've kind of brought it home and I'm happy for it to finish there. But you took them there through a journey where there were certain times I think, oh, whoa, where did that note come from? That was exciting. And you give the piece some character, like I say, rather than just being a series of just one note after the other. So there's no like rules for this. All I'm giving you here is guidelines. It's things to think about, and there's always going to be exceptions to that prove the rule. You know, I could give you a guideline. So, you know, your story arc for your solo is to start off playing relatively slow using lower notes, build up the speed and finish on something really high. That's a classic way of constructing a solo. I could throw some examples at you. My favourite example for this is Blues for Hollywood by Frank Gambale off the I think it's either Present for the Future or Brave New Guitar. I think it's Present for the Future, one of his early albums. It's one of my favourite guitar solos because it's so well constructed. It starts off low down, nice smooth lines, and he just kind of builds up, doing the sort of sweep picking that Frank does really, really well. It builds up the tension, it gets exciting, and he finishes on some really high notes at the end, and he really takes you on a journey. But when he finishes on that high note, it brings the whole thing to a climax. You think, yeah, that solo's achieved everything that it needed to do. But conversely, you could get a solo in some, you know, like hard rock metal context where this happens, where you go into the solo and immediately the lead guitar is blazing away at 100 miles an hour, because it's about going into the solo and carrying the momentum of the song forward. So whatever you do, you've got to do it in the context of the song. The solo needs to be part of the piece, rather than just an opportunity for you as a guitar player to show off. If you're just using it as a means to show how fast you can play or whatever, then you're completely missing the point. The solo needs to complement the song, but you can do things within the solo to make it your own. And like I say, to take the listener on a bit of a journey just within the context of that solo itself. It's the sort of thing that comes with practice. Initially, when you're just getting into solos, and particularly if you're doing this while you're improvising, there's like an awful lot going on in your brain and it feels like a bit of a struggle. But as you get more accomplished and more experienced, some of this becomes second nature, and as you're playing over a given chord progression, you just kind of instinctively, you know, finish on an unresolved note to give you the tension, or you finish on a resolved note to give you a bit of release. It takes time and practice, but you know, that's part of the deal of playing guitar, is you practice. But this is something you can do as like practical practice. It's not as like something dull like running through scales and exercises. It's actually playing against chord progressions and making music and being creative. So don't get bogged down with it, but it is something to bear in mind, because it's what sets you apart, rather than just playing a series of safe notes that you know belong to the key, to being able to play something that it's strong and it's got character, and it's something in its own right. Okay, so plenty of food for thought there, and hopefully you found that interesting and inspiring, and something you can go away and incorporate into your own playing and kind of develop your own soloing and your own lead playing. Hope you found that interesting. If you did, please click like down there. If you really enjoyed it and you want to see other videos that are posted on the channel, then please click subscribe, which is also down there. You're welcome to leave a comment, but I don't always see comments that are left on videos. YouTube's a bit rubbish at letting me know when people leave comments. So if you've got a specific question that you want to ask me, whether it's about guitar playing, music theory, guitar gear, anything at all, you're better off going here, filling that form in, send your question in. That way I'm guaranteed to see it and I can get around to answering your question in a future video. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.